Hi, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of Scale with Predictable Success. And today I am really delighted to have Julia Hamm, the President and CEO of Smart Electric Power Alliance, sometimes called SIPA, with us. Julia, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me, Les.
Well, now, you and I go back a while. We've worked together for many years, but for our listeners who don't know what the Smart Electric Power Alliance is and who Julia Hamm is, just tell us a little bit about your background, your own history of how you got to SEPA and what it does.
Sure. Well, let me start with the organization. So SIPA is a nonprofit, and it's been around for multiple decades now. So it was formed back in 1992 and actually has changed a lot over the course of the years. But today we are focused on fulfilling our vision, which is a carbon-free energy system by 2050. And so we work across the electric power industry to help all stakeholders with keeping up to date with what's happening with technology, policy, markets, and really focusing on the electric utility industry, the entities that regulate that industry, and the technology companies and other solution providers that work with electric utilities, ultimately to provide more clean energy on the system for the benefit of customers. And we do that through education, through research, a lot of stakeholder convening and facilitation. We are not a trade association, so we don't do any advocacy or lobbying, but really focused on being an unbiased resource for information and problem solving for the industry. So I have been, I first started working for the organization a long time ago, more than 20 years ago now, when I was just a year out of college back in 1999. And I came in, again, very entry level, fulfilling sort of a role that wore multiple hats, working with the board, helping with membership, doing some meeting planning. I left after a couple of years of doing that to go take on a different position in a related organization, but then came back as the CEO in 2004. And so I have been the CEO for a long time now, for 16 years, and it's been a fun ride.
It certainly sounds like a fun ride. And, our listeners are, many of them, just like me, they're business model nerds. What's your essential business model? How do you stay around?
Sure. So we have a relatively diverse set of revenue streams, although once we start talking about COVID, we'll talk about what needs to happen with that going forward. But about 50% of our revenue comes from trade shows and conferences, so convening in-person events. About 20% is from membership dues. Another 10 to 15% is from government grants. And then the rest is from contracts with individual companies where essentially on a fee-for-service basis, we are helping them with their own specific needs related to introducing more clean energy into their system.
Got it. And so, as you alluded, all of that's been upended. Obviously, we'll talk about that in a moment or two. But if we could just spool back, I don't know, it depends how you look at it, either 3 months or 400 years to the pre-COVID time, just as you were coming into 2020, in your world, in the world of SEPA, what was new, exciting, challenging? What did your big 30,000 foot strategic challenges and excitements look like before this all hit?
So, well, we've been around for a long time and have been working with the industry on incorporating more clean energy. Really, where we were coming into 2020 was that we as an industry have reached this tipping point where it was a bit of a challenge in the years and decades past to pull people into this momentum of the importance of more clean energy for the purpose of really reducing carbon because of climate change.
Right.
But we again, in 2019 really was the tipping point where the industry realized that they had to step up and play a leadership role. This could not be the industry being reactive to policy mandates or reactive to individual customer requests. And instead, that they need to play a leadership role in driving change. And that is a significant change and really put massive momentum behind SEPA, because that is all what, it is what we're about, is helping companies do that. And so there was this swing for decades, really trying to handhold and sort of pull people along, to this momentum change of, we don't need to pull people along anymore. They're going and they need our help.
Right. And that was a long time coming, and must have felt, really good to have got there, and maybe beginning to get less of a sense of you, with this Sisyphean task of pushing the rock uphill, you and SIPA and your fellow organizations, and beginning to feel, okay, there's something's happening here and we can follow along and build on it, or there's a lot happening here and we can follow along and build on it. And then early March, mid-March happens. I think, I get the feeling, just as we're recording this, coming towards the end of June, I think we're beginning to come to a point where we're starting to be able to see a bit of a shape of a narrative back in March. I know for me, I at the time, I just was doing what I needed to do, but I can now step back a little and say, okay, the first signs for me with this, and the biggest challenge was that. How did that, I want to trace through to where we are now, and then spend the majority of our time talking about where you see the future for you and SIPA, and how you're trying to design that future. But how did this all build? What's the narrative for you? What was the first inklings you're going to have to do something? And, talk us through just the pragmatics. Our folks would love to hear, just the reality of what it was like to take your organization. You maybe can share something about number of people, if you're comfortable with that. What were the mechanics of being the CEO? What did you need to do in March and April?
Sure, and I can talk about that both from sort of an internal perspective with our staff, our team, and then an external perspective in terms of our work with the industry.
Perfect.
So internally, so we are a team of about 50, and 75% of us are based in a DC headquarters office. The other 25% of folks always work remotely from home offices in various locations around the country, not necessarily by design, but because they are subject matter experts and relatively limited pool of people who are qualified for those jobs. So we were already, as an organization, quite far along in terms of our ability to effectively have people work remotely. With 25% of the people always doing that, we had the technology solutions already in place. There was already an expectation that when we did meetings, that we were using video so that our remote employees could video into those meetings and see the people in the room. So the actual transition going from an office environment to a remote work environment, I would say, relative to a lot of other organizations, I think was pretty simple for us.
Right.
There were a couple of last pieces. Well, actually, this is I seem like a genius in hindsight. There were a couple of trial policies that I put in place in the fourth quarter of 2019 that made it seem like maybe I had a crystal ball when I didn't. I was just coincidence. But
and were those around things like remote working?
Well, yeah. So one of them was that I had put in place a trial policy that all employees could work from anywhere 1 day a week. And so, we were testing that out, we're going to see how it went. And then I was going to make a decision at the end of Q1 2020, whether that would be I don't want to say permanent, but a policy with no specific end date. So putting that trial policy in place actually forced our team to start working on some of the last pieces of the puzzle that would effectively let everybody work from home remotely. So for example, we had moved almost everything to the cloud already over the past few years, but
Right.
our accounting system and our HR files and documents were all still on an in-house server. When I put in place the everybody can work from anywhere 1 day a week policy, it forced our IT folks
Of
to
course.
start working on how do you move those things to the cloud as well.
Right.
And so there are a couple other things like that coincidentally, so we all started working remotely on March 13th, which was a Friday. So whatever that Tuesday was, the 10th or whatever the date, March 10th or 11th, actually was the day that everything officially had moved to the cloud.
You do seem like a genius in retrospect.
Yeah, exactly.
A prophet and a genius. Yes.
Exactly. And then the other thing I had done was put in place a trial policy that we used to have a policy where people could wear jeans and dress relatively casually. We're generally a sort of very business casual environment, but
Right.
jeans and sort of more dressed down was for Fridays only before.
Right.
But at the end of, the second half of last year, I put in place a trial sort of, and everybody can wear jeans and dress more casually every day, unless you have external meetings.
Right.
And of course now we are all wearing, shorts and, whatever we want every day. So both of those trial policies are both now, really, truly
right.
Embedded.
And then as far as your forward-facing client activity, what were the biggest changes to hit you in the early stages?
So it was interesting to manage the team through this, because we have a phenomenal team, and
I've met them. They're wonderful.
Yeah, many of them, especially our subject matter experts, are very action oriented, and they're very mission driven and action oriented. So when this all happened, they immediately wanted SIPA to pivot and start doing things to help our members with things that were their new problems that were resulting from COVID.
Right.
And, I had to help the team take a step back and say, listen, I understand our customers, our members have this new set of problems in front of them, but they're not directly connected to our mission.
Right.
So in fact, what we need to do as an organization is get out of their way, right? We actually need to let them know we are supporting them by not bombarding them with information right now, or by not distracting them with things that are important but not urgent.
Yeah, it's easy to forget these was back in the days when, somebody I bought a 99-cent app from on the App Store sent me a 4-page email reminding me to wash my hands. We were, everybody was doing that. So you took the view, let's not do that. And I guess that was part of not being a trade association. It's not your job to fix everything for your members. It's your job to stay focused on, right. That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that was tough for a lot of members, or at least some members of the team, who said, no, but we are a membership. We're not a trade association, but we are a membership organization. We should do whatever we can do to help our members. And I said, well, no, we are a mission-based organization that happens to have members. Just to remind people of that. So we really, and we took the pulse through our board and some other members or customers were particularly close to validate that was the right approach.
Right.
And that it was. They said, yeah, and you have to keep in mind, a lot of our members are electric utilities. So they are the people who are providing all of us with the electricity we receive every day.
Right.
And these are companies who don't ever have employees work remotely. And many of them have thousands or tens of thousands of employees. So they were not only trying to figure out, how do we keep the power on? How do we maintain the system? How do we, when somebody has a service problem at their house, but we're not supposed to be interacting with people or getting close to people, how do we do that?
Right.
So but at the same time, they had to figure out how to transition their entire workforce to work remotely. So it was
And
the first.
they're almost not. I mean, and I've got to be careful because these are your customers and clients. But utilities historically have rarely been that nimble. I mean,
Mhm,
immediate
mhm.
flexing is not something that industry has required. The half-life of the information and products that they're offering is quite long. So that in
That's
itself has
correct.
got to have been a challenge, right? So when
Well,
did you?
but it's actually a fantastic, and that's one of the big takeaways I'm hearing people talk about already out of this, is that they have proven that they can do it. They
Right,
can be nimble. They can act quickly. They
right,
did a phenomenal job in this situation, pivoting to doing something totally different. And
right.
so that they've actually proven that they can do it.
And that's I'm talking as a total layperson, obviously here. That feels to me like a relatively untold story. When we're thinking about
Mhm,
emergency workers, we're going to the medical side of stuff.
mhm.
Delivery drivers have been talked about, and
Yeah.
I've no doubt you're hearing a lot more of it being in the industry. But for those of us a little distance from it, I'd never really thought about that from the utility point of view, just keeping the lights on and needing to pivot to do that. That's
They
a remarkable point to make.
they're absolutely essential workers. There's no
Right.
doubt about that. Yeah.
So then we start to realize this is not a bad dream, and it's going to have impact. What were the biggest moving parts in terms of perceived and likely impact to your own business model?
Well, for us, like I said, 50% of our revenue comes from getting people together in person for
Right.
trade shows and conferences.
Right.
So, yeah, we host probably somewhere on the order of 15 to 20 in-person events of varying sizes every year. And they literally range from taking a group of 30 people abroad for a week to
Mhm.
study what happens in another market, up to a 20,000 person trade show, and
Right.
everything in between. So again, in those early days, and I think it's sort of just as I'm talking to you, I'm sort of realizing what one of my own sort of personal takeaways out of this, and sort of what I think we did right.
And we'll be right back with Julia in just a moment to hear precisely what it was that she got right as a leader during this COVID crisis. We're also going to talk about the biggest single challenges she has faced as a leader during COVID, the changes she's made in running SEPA, how she and her team are approaching innovation, and much, much more. Now, if like Julia and me, you're an MSc, that's the most senior executive, whether you're the founder or CEO or managing director or lead pastor or madam secretary, whatever the title of the most senior person in your organization, if that's you, then you know one thing for sure. It can be really, really lonely up there. Sure, being the most senior executive is a great privilege, and it brings with it great responsibility, but it brings great challenges too. And sometimes we just don't have the right forum to go and share those challenges, at least not in a way in which we feel comfortable and supported, challenged, and held accountable. And I'm sure you've got a great team in your organization, a fantastic senior leadership team who supports you. But there are times when you're just not ready to share with your senior team just yet. And there are other times when you want to talk with people who have got a different perspective than from the inside of your organization. Sometimes you just don't want to distract your senior leadership team because of some of the other things that you've got going on. And you've almost certainly built a great support group of friends and family. But let's be honest, I know this and you do too. There are many times when you're grappling with a particular challenge, a growth challenge, either around your own leadership or the growth of your organization, and you just don't want to burden your friends or your family. And many times, even if you did, they often can't really help you. And that means they're left feeling frustrated and you're left feeling unfulfilled. And it's just because of that challenge, the challenge of it being lonely at the top, and yet I've got big challenges of my own to meet as a leader, that I started the Predictable Success Mastermind Group. Julia Hamm, our guest interviewee today, is a member of the Predictable Success Mastermind Group, along with a group of like-minded growth leaders just like you. And perhaps the Predictable Success Mastermind Group might be exactly the place to go for the support, accountability, and encouragement you need in these incredibly difficult times. So why not go take a look, make your own mind up, head over to predictablesuccess.com/mastermind and check it out. And now back to our guest today, Julia Hamm.
Was that
Right.
having patience was the right answer in so many of these situations, because when March 13th came, that sort of seems like the day, right? Like
Right.
March 13th, suddenly the light bulbs seemed to go off that this was real and meaningful for the US. You know, we had a meeting, a conference we were supposed to be hosting in early March, of 400-ish people. We had another one, and basically every month we have at least one big thing like that. And then our big trade show, our 20,000 person trade show, was scheduled for September. I watched as other organizations like us that host meetings all scrambled to postpone their events in late March and April. Originally it was sort of late March and April. Everybody scrambled to postpone them to July and August.
Right.
And we waited. And in hindsight, right, all of those people that postponed to July or August
Just had to do it again.
now had to do it again,
Right.
right? And they're back in the same position. And we waited to make decisions. We monitored what was happening. We knew what the trigger points were, if there were specific dates that were contractual or related to our constituents, our customers having to make decisions about whether they were going to go to something or not. But we did not rush to make
Right.
changes
Right.
to our plans. And I think that worked out for us well.
Clearly did. And that
yeah.
gave you some breathing room then. And I noticed in the interactions that you and I have had during this time that you're following an arc that I see the upper quartile of responsive organizations have followed as well, which is, immediate triage, all hands on deck, just do mechanically what's needed, hold off, pivot, sure, any immediate pivots, do that. But not for the smoke to clear, because we're nowhere near that yet, but at least to get enough of a view to begin to start to think creatively about what do we do next. I've been calling it leading from 5,000 feet. We're used to being up here at the 30,000 feet level as leaders. We went down to runway level and we were good at that because it needed to be done. But now we're just up a little bit. 5,000 feet level is nothing like what it was before, but we've got to start at least thinking about how to plan. Now, what has that felt like for you? Have you been off on the mountaintop on your own a lot? Do you have a small team, a group that you work with a lot? And what are you doing? What tools are you reaching for to try to get your head wrapped around what next? What do I do next?
So I would say that it varies. Well, at the organization level, I mean, obviously, I've got an executive team, so it's myself, my chief operating officer, and my chief strategy officer. So the three of us obviously do a lot of that.
We have to press pause there just for a second for our listeners to make sure they didn't hear you wrong. You've got two strategy officers.
No, I've got an chief operating officer and a chief strategy officer.
Oh, and the chief strategy officer. Oh, that's great.
Yeah.
Good.
Yeah.
Oh, I thought you said two strategy officers, because then I was thinking, all right, that's going to have fun having two sets of strategies coming in.
No, hopefully that's not what I said.
So that team gets together, and what have you been, where's your head as a team? What are you looking at? Are you looking at 3 months, a year, just throwing things against the wall?
Yeah.
How are you approaching it?
Yeah, we're thinking about things, sort of the longer term things, and I'll talk about that in a second, but I think it's also important to note that we are also there are other teams of people that are focusing on specific pieces of the business and what that needs to look like. So, and that has been working well. And, you know, you and I have had a lot of conversations about how to facilitate innovation in this environment and within sort of where SIPA is in the predictable success model. And
right.
I do think it has been working well that we've got different teams of people thinking about planning and plans and shifting and innovating and pivoting. But yes, at that executive level, it wasn't until, again, I was waiting for the dust to settle a bit. So at that executive level, our executive team started talking about scenario planning in, what is it now? It's June. So probably mid to late April,
Right.
was when I felt as though the dust had cleared enough that I could reasonably start thinking about scenarios.
Right.
And so, and really from a time scale perspective, really primarily focusing on the next 18 months and thinking about what I already had a grip on what this year looks like, you know, and this year's a lot, you know, this year is just, it is what it is. It's not pretty. Fortunately, we're financially healthy enough that we can ride through using money we've got in the bank for this year. So my primary concern was around 2021 and what 2021 look like.
With that emphasis on planned events, you don't have the option to wait till you get there. You've got to start thinking about that now, right?
Yeah.
Otherwise, it would be rinse and repeat from previous years.
Yep. And so, you know, we created 3 scenarios for what we thought 2020, really again, focused on 2021, but also one of the scenarios is sort of like absolute worst case, which then bleeds beyond 2021.
Right.
But I think the more real, you know, we're hoping, and I think of the more realistic scenario is that if we can manage through 2021, we'll be okay again.
Right.
So we have not made any decisions about 2021 at this point, but we have the scenarios. We are in the midst of our 2021 planning process. We always start planning for the next year in May or June. And so the team is planning now, but we won't make decisions until fourth quarter when, you know, so obviously we're never going to have all the information we need. There are still probably going to be a lot of uncertainties, but it's sort of back to this patience point, right?
Yes,
I'm going to wait until I have as much information as I can possibly have until we have to make decisions about what 2021 is going to look like. So the team is planning with the full acknowledgement that from a resources standpoint, we don't know what resources we're going to have available. And so they're planning with that in mind so that when we get to fourth quarter, we have a better sense of sort of what the financial picture might look like. We can then put into the official sort of final plan, which is always, of course, a possibility that could change as we get into 2021. But the plan as we head into 2021 will be based on the best available information we have fourth quarter.
And I'd love to move to talking for a bit about the internal communications of all of that and how you've been handling that as a leader. But before I do, I just want to pick up on one really piece of minutiae here, but I happen to know that many of our listeners would love to hear just a little bit more about it. When you talked about putting those internal teams together, so you've got your, you know, in our work, Team 1, the senior leadership team doing their work, and then you mentioned you've got a number of teams doing stuff on individual aspects, innovating around individual topics. Are those by and large siloized teams, or are they cross-functional, or are you doing both? What's been your approach to that? Do you let the subject matter experts do that? Do you encourage cross-functionality? How's that been working out?
Culturally, everything we always do is cross-functional. It is very rare that there is ever a siloed team working on something. That is part of our nature. And you know this because we've talked about it, but we work in this team of teams environment.
Right.
And so any project, you know, whether it's a well-established project or some sort of innovation project, always has people from across different functional areas to provide different input and perspectives into it.
Right.
So yeah, it really is a cross-functional effort.
And
although there are cases, I will say, you know, with some of the things we're focused on right now in terms of really sort of future looking, how might we need to pivot if large in-person events are more challenging in the future and potentially could generate less revenue for us. There are some things that the team is working on where I have provided specific guidance that, like, I know normally this is the group of people that you would have, you know, you are, you know, saying, hey, you executive A, you are accountable for this innovation project, including putting together the team. And I know that this is normally the team of people you would probably pull for that. But in this environment, I want you to think outside the box about who are other people on the team who really are good at thinking outside the box.
Right.
And
right.
put some of those people on the team as well, because this is just a place where we've got to think differently and not just think the way we've always thought.
In our terminology here, as you know, in predictable success, that we talk about injecting the V, you know, getting the visionary aspect of the VOPS model in there. Just broaden that out a little bit, Julia, to the challenges you have faced as a leader, generally just communicating in all of this. Talk to us a little bit about that. What's the approach you've taken with internal communications? Is it often, is it infrequent, but content driven? Just what's been your style and nature?
Yeah, my style has definitely been, there is no such thing as over communicating.
Right.
And I've gotten amazing feedback from the team about that. And so as soon as we went all remote, we started having weekly all hands staff meetings. So prior to this, we used to have monthly all hands staff meetings. So we've now been having weekly all hands staff meetings. And one of the technology tools is that had been in the plans, but was not prioritized until we all went remote, was essentially Slack. I mean, Slack is not the brand we use, but an internal Slack-like chat tool. Yeah. So that launched within a week of us going virtual, and I am in every group, and I am constantly, and it's both the work-related things, but also the social things. I'm in the recipes group. I'm in the parent support group. I'm in the social distancing funny memes group. You know, but you know, and I'm contributing, and so people are seeing. I'm making sure that I'm really visible, both on a professional level and a personal level, so that people still feel very connected to me. But yeah, over communicating, and you know, I feel like this is I'm saying this too many times, but I'm not. Again, this is sort of I feel like I'm over communicating, but I'm not, because I'm saying it to different audiences.
Right.
But one thing that really has stuck with me was a comment from a member of our team. So we've always done quarterly staff surveys. So when we did the end of Q1 staff survey, you know, sort of it was happening the first 2 weeks in April. So I got the results mid-April. So there were a few weeks of COVID in that. And that was what was fresh on people's mind when they were taking it. And one of my employees made a comment in the survey that a takeaway for them a learning from them out of this already was that no news is still news.
Yes. Yes.
And what they meant by that was that, you know, as we're having these weekly staff meetings, I'm very conscious of saying, I know you guys are really anxious about XYZ thing. Last week, I told you that this had happened with it. Nothing has changed since last week.
That's so important. Otherwise,
Yeah.
people, it's a vacuum and people fill it. You know,
Yeah.
they'll imagine stuff or presume stuff. That's really
Mm-hmm.
important. And probably a great segue into the two questions I'd love for us to close out with. One is just for you to reflect back on your own journey thus far. And I'm sorry to say that I think just literally this week as we're recording this, I'm beginning to get the sense that thus far is not as far as we thought it was. But thus far, what have you learned about yourself as a leader? And also, just as we speak, to hold us both transparent, it's towards the end of June. What do you feel for sure for next year for SEPA? So what have you learned about yourself as a leader thus far? And what, if anything, do you know for sure for SEPA for next year?
Mm-hmm. What I have learned about myself is that prior to this experience, if you had asked me sort of what are my strengths and weaknesses as a leader, I would have said that my strengths are all of the external facing things that I do, and that my weakness is all the internal stuff. And what I've learned is that that's not an accurate statement. What I enjoy and what I get energy from is the external facing stuff, but I'm actually very good at the internal stuff. I just don't enjoy doing it. So it's not a matter of it being a weakness and that I'm not good at it. It's just not how I prefer to spend my time.
Not what your preference was, right?
Yeah,
That's
yeah.
fascinating, because I do recall you've said that to me many times, that the forward-facing stuff is where you felt your strengths were. But this has proved that you've actually got all that it takes to do the internal stuff. It's just not what was floating your boat.
Yeah, yeah.
And what about the future looking forward?
Oh, geez. I don't know. I feel like there is a lot of uncertainty. I mean, the only certainty is that I don't think the future will look like the past.
Right.
Right?
That's as firm as it is, right? That's as firm as it is.
And when I think about it from a how we operate standpoint, we have had for years, we've had a lot of our employees who are based in the DC area saying, I don't understand why I can't work remotely, right? Why can't I work remotely all the time?
Right.
And I never had a good answer for that. And I still don't have it, and then now I'm like, well, I think we've proven that.
Yeah, exactly. There isn't any reason.
There isn't any reason. I mean, do you lose some value from not being together in person? Yes.
Right.
But do you gain as much, if not more, in other areas than what you're losing in, sort of that rapport, sort of the water cooler chat that happens physically? And I think I land at, it's either a wash, you gain as much as you lose, or maybe even in a number of cases, you gain more than you lose.
Right. Certainly, March wasn't the time to assess that, maybe not even early April, but I think we've all begun to get a sense of whether this has been a net positive for each of us individually or not. And I do think one of the things that I'm hearing and watching and seeing is that if and when we do get back to the point where that's an option, I think the cohort of folks who will always want to come in every day, there'll still be that cohort, but it will be smaller. The cohort of people who, given the option, would want to continue to work from home will be much larger. But I think there's a whole new thing evolving, which are folks not only entirely comfortable with, but who want a distributed approach, who want to be able to come in and get that vibe when they need it, maybe use it for strategic thinking, creative thinking, just as a break in routine, but who can then snap back and maybe get into ultra productivity mode when they're working in a more isolated environment. One way or another, one of the reasons I asked you on, Julia, is because of just the sheer privilege of watching you operate. And in a sense, I've had the privilege of seeing your brain work through a lot of those things as we've discussed many of the options that you have. And it just is a remarkable job that you've done with SEPA. And I really appreciate you coming on and sharing with us here. And I know our listeners will take so much away from it. I've said to some of the other folks recently on the podcast that I really want to come back in a year from now, wherever we are, as long as we're around, and touch in and see, how have things developed, because we're in a massive, amongst many other things, much of which is hugely negative. We're in the middle of a fascinating case study, and I would love to explore it a little longer. But for now, Julia, thanks so much for joining us.
Oh, thank you, Les. And not just thank you for having me on, but thank you for all the guidance you've given me. You've been a huge help, and couldn't have gotten to where I am without some of the insights you've given me throughout this journey. So thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you.